In an era where economies, militaries, and civilian life are deeply dependent on space based infrastructure, does the weaponization of satellites represent a more immediate and systemic threat to global stability than nuclear weapons? And should international law evolve to treat large scale satellite attacks as acts equivalent to strategic nuclear aggression? Okay, so ASAT warfare you're talking about, right? And the weaponization of satellites. So when it comes to the modern economies, the world economy, it's all interconnected, right? When it comes to military matters, when it comes to civilian life, all of these domains, all of these are deeply integrated with satellites for a variety of things, right? Communications. We are communicating right now. Much of that, depending on where you are, will be happening through satellite. We depend on satellites for communications, for navigation, for timing, for militaries depend on satellites for intelligence, for missile warning, for early missile warning systems. We depend on satellites for finance, for logistics, and so many things. So if satellites are weaponized or satellites are disrupted, then let's say a small number, relatively small number of key satellite systems are disrupted in some ways. So this could paralyze banking systems. This could paralyze air traffic management systems. It could paralyze large parts of the internet. It could also paralyze the command and control structures of various militaries, right? So space systems, satellite infrastructure, these are critical infrastructure now. These are now treated as critical infrastructure, and these are fragile systems, right? So that is the situation. Now, what do we mean by weaponized satellites? You're asking about weaponized satellites here. So how do you weaponize satellites, or how do you bring satellites into the domain of warfare? So one way of doing that, military means, is ASAT weapons, anti-satellite weapons. Ground launched missiles or air launched missiles, which will intercept a satellite in orbit and destroy it. So that's a kinetic ASAT weapon, anti-satellite weapon. So these weapons physically destroy satellites, and they create a profusion of debris, which is a disaster. Then you also have non-kinetic tools, non-kinetic means of disrupting satellites, like jamming, like spoofing, dazzling or blinding of sensors, cyber attacks against satellites, or cyber attacks against the ground station that controls the satellite, or interfaces with the satellite. This sort of thing. These are non-kinetic tools, right? And you also have concepts of nuclear armed satellites. I mean, if you watch James Bond movies from the 1980s and 1990s, in the 20th century, there are concepts of nuclear armed satellites. And we've had space-based nuclear detonations. The Americans and the Russians both have, tested nuclear weapons in orbits, in orbit, in Earth orbit. So if you have a nuclear detonation in orbit today, and if you, well, depending on where the detonation happens, it can disable entire constellations of satellites, right? So clearly, space is now on the verge of being weaponized. We certainly have the means and the tools for doing that. So overall, the weaponization of satellites is, you could say, it's a risk multiplier. It's a systemic risk multiplier. It is a systemic risk multiplier for nuclear danger. It's not a separate threat. It's not a higher order threat. It's a risk multiplier for nuclear danger. So if there's an attack on satellite infrastructure, this will obviously disrupt, like I said, global finance, navigation, communications. It will create systemic shocks, economic shocks, political shocks. And this will happen without ever crossing the nuclear threshold. Yeah. It will make it harder for militaries to monitor what their adversaries are doing. If there are agreements between two nations, maybe arms control agreements, if satellites are taken out of service, out of commission, then you'll not be able to monitor and enforce arms control agreements or whatever. So if this happens, if satellites are taken out, if space is weaponized, this will increase opacity during a time of crisis, the fog of war, like they say, friction. And this will have the effect of raising the possibility, the probability that nuclear weapons could be used either in confusion or in panic. So nuclear weapons are still way more dangerous than satellites, and the weaponization of satellites and weaponization of space. So So the weaponization of satellites is still, not the most dangerous thing in the world. It's a risk multiplier. Nuclear weapons remain the most decisive existential danger for human beings. They remain the most decisive existential danger for the planet. Um, Satellites are a separate thing. They are connected, but they are different. And today, if you have nuclear weapons deployed in space, or nuclear operations in space, that kind of blurs the line between a space war and a nuclear war. And so that's where we are. So I would not say that international law can evolve to, probably, you can't really treat large scale satellite attacks as something that's equivalent to strategic nuclear aggression, but the lines are blurring now because it's all interconnected. So it's a strategic risk multiplier. It's a systemic risk multiplier.